This is a complicated sugya and a very broad sugya, which has so many different implications, ramifications, and it is relevant in two areas. Most of the sources we have on our sheet deal with monetary issues, but the question is also sometimes in our history a question of din and nefashos. I apologize one moment, I'm just standing up because I want to put on some more lighting here. So I just want to mention two very dark periods in our painful history. One is probably the darkest period in the history of the world, which is the Holocaust. And usually I don't speak in exaggerations. I say probably the darkest period in the history of the world. And another is also a dark history for the Jewish people. And I'll explain what I am referring to. The fundamental question is, could a person care for his own interests when by doing so, he might be causing damage or harm to others? And the context of the question is, when we learn Chumash Bereshis, the way I was noheg, and many of you are familiar with my sforim, especially the new publication, the new edition of Minchas Osher al HaTorah. So I am always very careful when we speak about Maaseh Avos, just to explain. To us, the Avos Hagdoshim, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and then Moshe, Aharon, and the other giants of yore were not mere mortals. The Ramban writes in his introduction to Chumash Shemos, Maaseh Avos Yitzira Lebonim. Everything they did, everything that happened to them, any event that took place involving these giants dictated and determined the entire future of Klal Yisrael till the end of days. So we really don't have any personal questions on Yaakov Avinu or the Avos Hagdoshim, but we also learn these parshiyos, the Fi Pshuton, for two objectives. One is if we could learn Musar and Torah, and Pilpula Dioraita, just to develop sugya. So in Minchas Osher, in Chumash Bereshis specifically, there are many discussions which we have a kasha on Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, or other giants, and we develop a sugya. But we are fully aware that whatever Yaakov Avinu did, or the hiyoımhashchor, there was nothing personal about it. So the question I asked, Chazal exalt the tznius of Rachel. What a great tzedekah she was. Yaakov gave her some money because Rachel and Yaakov were aware that her family might put a trick on Yaakov and give him Leah instead of Rachel. They were aware of this possibility. So Yaakov made up with Rachel Simonim, and the Gemara Megillah Daf Yud Gimel says, and what was the tznius? At the last moment, when Rachel became aware of Lavan's plan, that he's gonna give Yaakov Leah instead of Rachel, she just couldn't bear the embarrassment of her sister when she would be rejected, and therefore she passed over the Simonim to Leah to avoid embarrassment from Leah. So if we would be the ones, if I would be a Rav, and Rachel would come to ask me, is this the right thing to do? I probably would paskin no. Yes, you're doing something very nice for your sister, but does Yaakov deserve it? Yaakov doesn't want to marry Leah. He wants to marry you. So it's like Teufels L'Balchayva, Mokim Shechav L'Achayim. You're avoiding preventing embarrassment for your sister. But for your sister, it's an embarrassment of 10 minutes, of an hour, of a day, of 2 days. She'll get over it. But Yankov will be stuck with a wife that he has no interest in. So once again, in retrospect, yes, this was the way it needed to be. 50% of the shlotim came out of Leah. That is the way it needed to be. And looking back at the giants of your boat, Rochel and Leah were designated to be the Heilige Imohos. But just judging from a human view, Rochel does whatever she does to avoid embarrassment from Leah. Did she need to take into account how this will affect Yankov? He also has what to say. So I'm just using this for a springboard for discussion. Is a person entitled to care for himself, his own interest, when he is indirectly causing damage or harm to others? And could he care for a family member, like Rachel cared for her sister Leah? Doing something for family when you know that indirectly you are encouraging damage or harm to others. So I want to share with you 3 questions that actually the poskim dealt with in 2 different dark periods, Holocaust. So some of the Gedolim that shared stories and halachic dilemmas of the Holocaust, and I want to specifically mention 2 great tzaddikim and Talmidei Chachamim. Number 1 is Shas Teshuvas Memamakim, Rebbe Ephraim Shlit. He was a great Talmid Chacham in the Kovna ghetto. And this book is an amazing book. 5 Chalokim Shas Teshuvas Memamakim Kishmoy Keinhu. And he deals with questions that were asked in the depth of despair. So he was in Ghetto Kovna. There was no official role in the ghettos. The Germans didn't care about Rabbanim, but he was a major Talmid Chacham, and most of the shaylas came to him. And he answered shuvas. And he used to scribble the sources on scrap paper, wherever he could achieve some paper, and bury those notes by the posts of the barbed wire surrounding the ghetto, hoping that if he will survive, he will try to retrieve those notes and somehow develop them into Shalas Teshuvas, which he did. He survived. He retrieved many of those setalach, and he wrote 5 volumes, Shalas Teshuvas Memamakim. I recently met his son, and he told me they're reprinting a new edition of the Mamakim, and I'm anxiously waiting to get it. I only have 1 chelik of the Sefer, and I desperately was looking for the others, and I couldn't find them. So I hope in the very near future, his son told me that they are reprinting the Sefer. That is 1. The other one, Reb Hershel Meiselish, was the Dayan in Weiss. He survived the war, and he was a Rav in Chicago, a tremendous Talmid Chacham, a Satmar Chosid, and I got to know him. It was a big schus to know him. He was one of those great Hungarian Rabbanim that came from a generation that we didn't know, the pre-Holocaust generation in Hungary. And he published a sefer after the Holocaust called Mekadshe Hashem, Shuvas exclusively from Rabbanim that perished in the Holocaust, that were killed and murdered by the Nazis. Most of the letters, the Shuvas, are correspondence with him, but not only with him, with many others. And he wrote an introduction to Mekadshe Hashem, in which he tells his own personal story during the Holocaust, and also shares with us some of the halachic dilemmas. So, what was the shaila? The Germans demanded from the Judenrat, from their Jewish servants, a quota. We want 300 people in this transport. And usually this transport went directly to the killing fields, either the gas chambers. And a person becomes aware that 2 of his children were snatched off the street, and they're on those cars, those cattle cars, or waiting in line to go in the cattle cars? Is he entitled to get them away and to save them, knowing that 2 other kids will be snatched from somewhere, either from the street or they'll break into houses because they need the number? And if they won't come up with that number, the Nazis will kill them. So is a person entitled to save his own, knowing that 2 other Yiddish Kinderlach will perish instead of his children? What a painful shaila. We should never, ever need to deal with these questions again. But I want to share with you a terrible feeling. We also didn't believe that we never, ever will need to see these sights again. And what we saw in Simchas Torah is reminiscent, brings to mind terrible sights of the Holocaust. That is one version of the question. Another version that was quite common: the trains going to death. And many were aware by that stage that they're just going to be exterminated, going to be killed. And some young, brave people broke off a plank of the wall of the cattle car, or broke open a window, and they wanted to jump out to safety, hoping to safety. And the other people in the car objected because they were afraid if the Nazis or the Germans will see that some people escaped, they'll punish all the others, they'll torture them. And there was fighting going on in the cattle car. And many wanted to prevent those that wanted to jump out. And they insisted, we don't care. We believe we're all going to perish and we want to save ourselves. So these 2 questions are what we are dealing with. So even though most of our sources are monetary, I just give 2 examples in which we're dealing with Dina Nefashos. Another dark period in our history was the Cantonists in the Russian army under the Russians. And that was a Xeda that tore Jewish communities apart. And there are a few chuvas in the days of the Chassam Sofer about this story. So the Russian decree was every Jewish community needs to give a number of Jewish youth to serve in the Russian army. Service in the Russian army was not like the IDF, the Israeli army. We always like to complain, Charedim, and sometimes we are right with our complaints. I don't want to sound negative. Yes, serving in the Israeli army is not like sitting in yeshiva, definitely not. But it's a Jewish army. And the army does its best to be forthcoming and accommodating. Every soldier has time to daven, kosher food to eat. He could wear his yarmulke and tzitzis and pay us proudly. After all, it's a Jewish army. But those that were conscripted into the Russian army served for 20 years, for 25 years. Their life was destroyed. No Yiddishkeit, nothing. And they couldn't get married. They were serving in the army. Many of them died in the crazy wars, and not only in the wars, but in the brutal treatment they had in the Russian army. And it wasn't personal. They didn't look for Yankov or Shimon or Reuven or Yehuda. There was a quota. The community, depending on the size of the community, needed to give a certain number. The rich and the well-connected always saw to it that their children would be safe. And the poor paid the price. And communities were torn asunder. So much machlekes. The poor people that didn't have the connections were frustrated and angry, and they were ready to kill because their kids were always the ones that were snatched away from home and taken into the army. While those that were rich and affluent always paid a ransom, they paid shoichad, and they saved their kids. The most significant discussion is in Sefer Shalos Tshuvas Galia Masechet. Reb David, he was the Rav of Novardok, so he was there. The Chassam Sofer writes a tshuva from far away. So if you people will be interested in getting more into the din nefashos part of this shaila, then we can discuss it maybe next week's shiur, or we might be moving on to another topic. I just gave three examples, which are not only about monetary issues, but about din nefashos mamish. But the dilemma is the same dilemma. Am I entitled to care for myself and for my own, my children, my family? I want to save them from danger and from pain and from suffering or death, knowing that somebody else will have to step in, somebody else will be taken, and his life will be negatively affected. Is that legitimate or not? So after this introduction, let's embark on our journey. So I think this discussion is a fascinating discussion. And a minchas sosh, sometimes when I learn minchas sosh, I'm really spoiled. So I brought together about 15 sources. From Shas, Yerushalmi, Poskim, Shulchan Aruch. Different questions, many different areas, but fundamentally, they all boil down to the same dilemma. Let's start off in Baba Basa, Daf Chesed Medalef. Let's just learn the Gemara. Rabbi Pasach Oitzis B'Shnei B'Tzoros. It was a year of famine, and Rabbi had a responsibility to give out funds. Omar, Yekanzu Bale Mikra Bale Mishnah Bale Gemara Bale Alocha Bale Agoda Amay Oretz Lo Yekanzu. I don't have money to pay for ignorance. I want to provide only for the Bnei Torah. Dochik Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram v'nechnas. Omeloi, Rabbi Parnasai, please give me money, help me. Omeloi b'ni korisa, omeloi lav, shonisa, omeloi lav. The sequence is a bit strange. First he asks him korisa. Korisa was mikra. He says no. And then he asks shonisa. If he doesn't know chumash, how would he know mishnayos? Well, today, that would be the right way to ask. Some of us don't know a pasuk in chumash, but there might be booking tzayis. That is very common in our yeshivas. But it should be the other way around. You should first ask Shanisa, are you a lamdin? And if he says no, at least could you learn chumash or tehillim? Omer b'ni korisa, omer olav, Shanisa, omer olav. Im came b'mea fa'anescha. I don't give money to ignorant people. I just give money to Talmidei Chachamim. And he begs, Parnaseni kekelev ka'orev. I'm an animal. But according to Allah, a person needs to feed his animals as well. Parnasei. Basa denafek, Yosef Rabbi v'kumet stayer. Omer, oili shenotati piti la'amors. He regretted. The guy touched his heart, but then he regretted, I shouldn't have given him money. Omer aforav Reb Shimon beRebbi. Reb Shimon was Rebbe's son. Isn't that Yonasan ben Amram Talmidcha? He looked familiar to me. Isn't that your great Talmud, Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram? She'enei roitze lehenes mikvoi Torah b'yomav. He didn't tell you who he is because he doesn't want to be nehan mikvoi the Torah. But he's a great Talmid Chacham. But kuv ashkach, Omer Rebbe, yekanzu hakol. And it became clear that that person was a great Talmid Chacham. So Rebbe said, we can no longer know who is, who isn't, who's chashiv, who's not. Let them all come in. Rebbe letame, the Omer Rebbe, ein poranut bo la'olam Rebbe shel Amei Oretz. Rebbe had a very negative opinion about Amei Oretz, and that is why lechatchila he didn't want to support them. And then Chazal tell a fascinating story. Ki aho, the Meikalele de Shoda at Tveria, the authorities demanded taxation on the city of Tveria. So the working people, in Israel, the Haredi community, there's a concept, Haredi Oved. That is a number two citizen, lower class citizen. Haredi Oved, he's working as if that is something very ugly to say about a person, that he's working. Because Rabbi Paskin that the Talmidei Chacham don't need to pay taxes. If we need to carry the entire financial burden, we're going to leave town. Leave. I don't care, leave. Palga. So 50% of the community left. The remainder people, working people, said, now we even have a bigger burden to carry. Let the Rabbanim carry part of the burden. Lo. Arakinan, Aroiko, Arkakulu. Pashahi Koibis. There was one guy that had a cleaners. He was the only guy left in town besides the Koilel. Well, we have some communities in Israel in which nobody works. Everybody learns. Pashahi Koibis, Shadia Koibis. So the authorities said he should pay the entire sum or a Koibis. So that last guy closed his cleaners and he left town as well. Nobody was left besides the Koil guys. Poke Kalila. And then the authorities decided no taxation. So Rebbe says, this is what I've been saying all along. If in this town there would be only Talmud Chachamim, nobody would need to pay anything. So this is an interesting story. But the Ramban and the Ritva have a disagreement. What's our take on this story? Could we learn a halacha? The Ramban has a lengthy discussion, and the Ramban says, when those people asked the Rebbe, Arokinan, are we entitled to leave town? The Rebbe said, yes, we're entitled to leave. If you don't want to pay because you argue that the Koil guys need to participate in this payment, you're wrong. They don't need to pay. It's all about you. But if you want to leave, you're entitled to leave. And then Ramban wants to learn from here. Yeah, people could leave town even though they are aware. If we leave, the people that cannot leave will need to pay more. But they have the right to care for themselves. I don't want to pay tax. I want to go live elsewhere. That's exactly what's happening. Jews and many other people, especially affluent people that have money, are leaving New York and all moving down to Florida and to Texas, where more friendly environment, less tax, it's easier to make money. I know nothing about the story, but you know better than me. So the Ramban wants to prove from this sugya, I am entitled to leave town because there's too much taxation. Even though knowing that I will leave, others will have to pay more. So unlike the modern system in those days, the non-Jewish authorities demanded that the Jewish community come up with a sum. That was anti-Semitism. And that's the way it was for hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years. The Goyim said, Jews are rich, you have money, I know, under your beds. And they demanded the Jewish community come up with a sum. So every person that leaves town places a greater burden on those that stay. The Ritva, for some reason, is not on our sheet, but the Ritva says no. When they say Arokinan, and Rebbe says Aroiko, that was not a shaila and a tshuva, that was a threat. They told Rebbe, if you're not going to say that Talmidei Chachamim need to pay tax, then we're going to leave. And Rebbe said, if you want to leave, leave. I can do nothing. I'm not going to change my psak. So two different interpretations, Ramban and Ritva, what we could learn from this sugi. Choshe Mishpot Shin Peiches. We move on. Hoya roya nezek ba'olav mutar lahatzel asmaya papisha lidei ze bo'anezek la'acher. So the Ramot isn't clear. What is he talking about? So this is a Yerushalmi primarily that the Rishonim quote. We're dealing with a river that is overflowing, and this happens all the time. I think just a few weeks ago in Brooklyn, there were floods, terrible floods. Borough Park was almost submerged. So a person sees that the river is rising, and he has a field right next to the river, and he wants to dig a ditch to divert the water. It shouldn't destroy his field, so he's diverting the water aside, and the water will get into other fields. So if he does nothing, his field will be destroyed. The Rama says he is entitled. He could dig a ditch to save his field, even though he's indirectly causing damage to others. Let them do the same. I don't need to care for them. I am entitled to care for myself. Sma comments, quoting the Ramuk Yosef, but if the water already is on his field, he cannot now dig a ditch and have the water go into other fields. The Goen, Yerushalmi Perek Gimel, Ro Amas Hamayim Shoitefes Bebo L'toch Sedeu, Ad Shelo Nichnasu Hamayim L'toch Sedeu, רשאי לפנותו למקום אחר. משנכנסו, אין רשאי לפנותו למקום אחר. And then the Yerushalmi learns from this halacha similar case of taxation. And that is the kleisoi argira, adelo yesenahan kleisoi argira shoralameima plan of a Daviditi. But if they already demanded money from him, he cannot get away and send them to others. So, coming back to Bava Basra, the people that threatened to leave town, it wasn't a personal claim the government had against them. It was a general claim to the community. And that is why, according to the Ramban, they had the right to escape. So the Yerushalmi deals with the question when the authorities demand money from him, and he wants to say, I'm poor, I don't have money, go to my neighbors. He's not allowed to do that, but he's allowed to run away. They shouldn't find him. So, Rama, Sma, Biragro are the same package, the same story. Shach Kuf Samach Gimel, similar, but a different source, which is interesting. Many Gedolim reached the same conclusion, but they learned it from different sources. So according to the Goen, the Ramah is based on Yerushalmi. The Shach, similar psat, based on a Gemara in Yevonis. Let's have a look at the Shach. HaMelech usar shematel eize dover al oshir echod u'shnayim, v'yesh liudi echad koyach b'heichal HaMelech v'hasar l'shtadel lepotro. So the authorities demanded from one or two individuals, and now we're speaking with individuals, they should pay. We don't know exactly what the context was, but in the feudal system, they did whatever they wanted, demanded whatever they wanted. And then there's a macher. You know what a macher is? A macher is in English, in Yiddish, in Ivrit, in all the languages. A macher is the guy that has connections and protects you. And he could get his friends off the hook. But then he knows that the authorities will demand the same sum from others. Irashai latzilam, olo. Pasuk b'tshuvas mahari baal, mahari ben leiv. Im kvar etil hamelech al hanoshim yeduim, ובפרט oisav ben nilkedu berishto, אז אין יהודי רשאי להשתדל לפוטרם בשום עניין, שיזיק לאחרים. אבל אם יוצאו גזרה להטל על שני אנושים בסתם, יוכל יהודי להשתדל על איזה אנושים שרוצים, שלא יהיו בכלל הגזרה. It is similar to what the Sma says on the previous question. So if there's a rumor, and we know that the authorities will demand a certain sum of money from two rich people, part of the community, but they did not specify who are the ones with the bad luck. Then if you have connections, you are entitled to get out of the loop. But if they already caught you and they said, you need to pay, you're not allowed to try to get away, and then they will demand from others. Once again, we're dealing with money. the Gemara in Bava Basra, the Yerushalmi, the Shulchan Aruch, the Shach. It's all about money. And the Shach learns from a question of nefashos, and that's in the Yevamah scientist. V'yachmona melech al Mephibosheth ben Yonasan ben Shaul, shelo heviro. So this is a story of Shaul and the Givonim. The Givonim fought the Jews, and Shaul killed some of them, and they demanded, before making peace with David Melech Yisrael, 7 members of Shaul's family to be hanged. Very complicated sugya for us to understand in our modern worldview. But David HaMelech had a Rachmanas on Mephibosheth ben Yonasan ben Shaul, because Yonasan was David's best friend, and he had a Rachmanas on Mephibosheth. Lo heviroto. So the Gemara says, how does David decide mi yichye v'mi yamas? Heviran lifnei ha'orein. Kol sho'oren kol toin chai. He left it up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Wasn't his personal decision. V'yachman HaMelech al Mephibosheth ben Yonasan ben Shaul shelo heviro lifnei ha'orein. V'chi mas aponim yesh b'davar. Ele sheviroi v'koltoi, v'bikishu levrachma v'poltoi, v'akati masaponim yesh b'davar. Why did he pray for Mephibosheth and not for the others? Bikish rachmim shelo yekoltenu ha'oroin. Maharibal have proofs from this Gemara. If the Oren would be koilate, then David wouldn't daven, because he knows if he is out, somebody else comes in. If he saves his life, he's jeopardizing someone else's life. But as long as he wasn't in, Loi Kolte Oren, David is entitled to daven. And he davened, Shelo Yikleteno Ha'orein. So the Shach and the Sma, 2 different sources of Choshen Mishpat, reached the same conclusion. And it is also based on the Yerushalmi. If you are already in trouble, you can't save yourself when you know others will bear the brunt. But if you are not yet in trouble, you are entitled to save yourself, even though you know somebody will need to pay the price. So when I connected, it was exactly what Shlomo discussed, the Shiur. Shiur has a lengthy discussion. And in the middle of his tshuva, I think that is what Reb Shlomo discussed. V'nezkarti masa sheyochid makzinim hemed bedin poten sar echot begolol maglinas medinas papals. I don't know, or pals or fals, whatever it is. Germany. Lefnei mishpat hagolol shebekehela kedosha Heidelberg. V'al yedei zeh pachadu v'yoro v'chiloch az l'klal Yehudim shebemedina hanal. There was a powerful Jew, and he had the chutzpah. In those days, it was considered a chutzpah to make a claim against one of the powerful leaders of the Goyish community. Obviously, that Jew was powerful enough, and he wasn't afraid. But the members of the community were terrified, because that guy was a man of power, and he could hurt the entire community. And they were willing to put together money to pay off the claim. Just don't start up with that guy. And the Chavasima comes out with this surprising psak, and he says, we have no right to demand from him not to stand up for his rights. If he has the power, if he wants to make a claim and go to court against that guy, he's entitled to do so. And he does not need to abstain, being afraid that it might hurt the community. Which is very interesting. And then, if we go down, he brings the Gemara in Bava Basra to make his point. And then he shares with us another fascinating story, which I don't know much about. 4 lines before the bottom of the page. Ulachem pasakti kasher hoiso, V'yadet Tzarfatim, I don't know what the Rosh Tevis Kuf Kuvav means, or Bikshu lahapil beis v'gimel batim shem b'choimo, lasoisa ir prutzo, shem kvar gozer asar al bayis proim yasu le'ishtadel ki al yedei yasei yegia nezek l'chaveiroi, makal mokan, kol elu behezek vadei v'boror. So, obviously, the government, there was a chayma, and they wanted to open a gate in that chayma, and they needed to tear down a few houses. And the people whose houses were designated for demolition wanted to use protection and say, no, don't do it here, do it 300 meters down the road. And then other houses will be demolished. So as long as the authorities didn't decide exactly where they want to do that, he's entitled, the homeowners, the house owners, the real estate owners are entitled to do a shtadlis, go elsewhere. But after they decided, this is where we want to breach the wall, and these are the houses we need to destroy, they are no longer entitled to try to send them elsewhere. So all the sources we quoted up to this point are actually on the same page, same principle. Kesef HaKodeshim, next page, the Buchacharav, is the first one that wants to say, maybe Dina Nefashos are different than Dina Momenis. And even if we say, regarding monetary issues, a person is entitled to say, I care for myself. I'm not responsible that others might need to pay. But Bina Nefashos would be different. You cannot save yourself and directly put other people's lives in danger. But then he writes, third line, Ka'esru isi v'sof simen kuf samach gimel she'ed yashach b'shem ha'ari ben lev raya mamash etzilu lemifaboshes mash masham deloi svira le'lachalek ben momen le'sakona. Because the Shach deals with a monetary issue, Mahari ben Lev, and he brings a raya from the Gemara in Yevamah, and that directly deals with Dina Nefashos. So the Kesef HaKodeshim was the B'chacharav. He was a great gadol, wrote many svarim, always very fascinating, innovative, interesting svaras. And he, for himself, argues we cannot compare Momenis to Nefashos. But actually, it's both ways around. So what we're seeing right now on our screen is Nerish yesh lachalek b'momen l'sakana. And even if we say regarding monetary issues, a person is entitled to say, I care for my money. I bear no responsibility for the fact that if I save my money, others will need to pay up. But being in a Nefashos, you need to be machmer more. But when we move over to the next page, he says totally the opposite. Maybe by Dina Nefashos, a person has more right to save himself. I need to save my life. So regarding Momenis, he says, then gamim kavanos letoves atzmoi ein lo ligrom hefsed nefesh zulasoi. So regarding Dina Nefashos, no, I think it is similar to what he said in the beginning. Person is not entitled to save his life and jeopardize the life of others.
Because of my causes? The general of nefesh?
I think so. Yes, probably my causes. You have no right to save your life. So it's not mamish similar to my causes, because by my causes we're dealing with killing a person directly. Taisus in Sanhedrin says, if I am passive and the goyim want to take me and throw my body on an infant, but I'm not doing anything. I do not need to object. So our case is somewhere between Kumvase and Sheva Altas. I am not directly destroying another person's life, but I am doing something. I'm not totally passive. I am doing something to salvage my life, even though indirectly I will be causing danger to other people's lives. There's a fascinating Chazon Ish which is not on our sheet, or for some reason it doesn't appear in the Siman in my Sefer. So the Chazon Ish deals with a theoretical story, which with modern technology is no longer theoretical. So the Chazon Ish deals with a question. Person shot an arrow or threw a spear, and that spear or arrow or bomb will kill 10 people. And he could divert it to another side, and only one person will be killed. But that person's life is not in danger. Is that the right thing to do? So the Chazon Ish, theoretically, in principle, did not write tshuvas. There are no tshuvas halacha l'maisa written by the Chazon Ish. I don't know why, but that was his philosophy. But the Talmidim of the Chazon Ish say that this was an actual question. He was a truck driver, and there's something wrong with his brakes, and he couldn't stop his truck. And it dawned upon him, the steering wheel was working, but the brakes were not. And if you would just let the truck go, a lot of people would be killed. He turned the steering wheel and he crashed into a wall, but one person was killed. And he was devastated. And he asked the Chazon Ish, did I do the right thing? He acted instinctively. And in that split second, he had no one to ask. And that is what the Chazon Ish was dealing with. But the Chazon Ish didn't want to write Shalos Tshuvas, so he didn't relate directly to the question. But that's the story. So the Chazon Ish asks a theoretical question. An arrow is going in a direction, it'll kill many people. Could we make it move sideways? Today, with guided ammunition, just one moment. Today, with guided missiles and devices, this is a very practical question. And the Chazon Ish writes a gewaltige chiddush, and he says, it is the right thing to do. Are we allowed to kill one person to save others? It's a Yerushalmi Perek Ches of Masechet Rumis. No, you have no right to do so. So the Chazon Ish differentiates and he says, there's a difference between a Maisa Hatzalah and a Maisa Hariga. The Yerushalmi deals with the situation in which Goyim tell a group of Jews, cannibals, give us one. We want one of you to be killed. And if you don't cooperate, we're going to kill you all. And the Gemara says in Yerushalmi, it's nowhere in Bavli, it's Yerushalmi Perek Ches of Teves. We say, we never will decide mi yechir v'mi yomes. That is up to a Kodesh Baruch Hu. We will give you none of our own. And if you insist to kill us all, let it be. So the Chazon Ish writes, why would this be different? When the Chazon Ish writes a gewaldige chiddush, he writes, giving out a person to be killed is a maisa achsori. We have no right to do that. Even though we could salvage the many and destroy the one, you have no right to do that. Leave it up to a Kodesh Baruch Hu. But turning the steering wheel in order that the truck shouldn't kill a group of people is a maisa rachmoni. It's an act of mercy. It's not an act of killing. It's an act of saving. So even though you are aware that by moving that guided missile aside or turning the steering wheel, you're going to be killing the one, it is the right thing to do. I think only the Chazon Ish could write a Chiddush like that. So coming back to our fundamental question, is a person right to care for his self or his own, even though he knows that others will pay the price? Our conclusion from all the sources we discussed, we still have a few more on our sheet, but I doubt we'll get around to do that. So according to all the sources we discussed, as long as I am not yet caught or in the loop, I have the right to do everything I can. I could leave town. I could divert the water to go sideways. I could care for mine, even though others might pay the price. So regarding Din Nefoshes, if we want to come back to the question that was asked, and it appears in the introduction of the Shalom Eizelish to Sefer Mekadshe Hashem, I think a person is entitled to save his children. And let us hope that no one else will be put on that train. We can never know. It's up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Everything is Hashgacha, but he is entitled to save his own. I don't know whether many of you are aware, does the name Yisrael Kastner say anything to you? I don't know. But Yisrael Kastner was a Hungarian Jew that organized a train, and he reached an agreement with the Germans, paying money, and a few hundred Jews were on that train, and they were saved. And he had various shady, questionable activities saving. Some of his family members, some of his friends. He was judged by an Israeli court. They found him guilty. He appealed. They acquitted him. And the story of Yisrael Kastner is a very well-known story in Israeli politics going back 60 years. The Satmar Rebbe of Yolish was on Kastner's train, and that is how he was saved. And those questions were similar to what we discussed today. He took advantage of his power and his negotiations and his connections to save some of his family. I think al pi halacha that would be legitimate, because he was the one that organized that plan, and his family was highly represented on that train that took them to safety more than others. So this is a fascinating discussion. We brought many sources from Choshe Mishpat, and everything seems to fit in to the same pattern. And as I said, the sources we quoted are all about Muminus, but the same theoretical questions sometimes in our history affected Nefoshes. I apologize for 1 minute, 1 moment, I'll be right back.
Anybody, we'll probably have a chance to submit a question or two. I have one that came up here. Anybody want to submit a question?
So do you have any questions?
Yes, can the Rav hear me?
Yes. For some reason, okay, I see now.
A Pikuach Nefesh question and a business question. A Pikuach Nefesh questions. If someone got a tzav to join a unit which would be subjected to questions of sakanas nefashos, and his father is an ex-general of Protexia and can put him into a unit that's in an office and an intelligence unit. Mutter or Asr? Real life case.
Now, 2 young soldiers just stepped into my house, and that is why I got up from my seat. 2 wonderful young boys. אתם מבינים אנגלית? שניכם? יידיש גם? So 2 young soldiers just walked into my house, באו לכאן. And also a Rav walked into my house. Shalom.
So,
That's one.
hello.
Two.
Those are
Welcome.
Rabbanu soldiers.
So these two wonderful young boys, I assume they came to ask for brachas. Brachas. Okay, techef. So, you know, most of the young soldiers I know would object to this plan, and they would say, we want to fight for Israel. We don't want to sit in an office. We prefer to be out there in the field. A father that's concerned about his son, I think, is entitled. The army needs people, not only in combat units. You know, an efficient army has logistics. Somebody needs to feed the soldiers. Everybody is part of the war effort. So I think halachically, he is entitled to do so. Especially, it is not exactly the same scenario as we discussed today, that there's a certain quota. And if you go out, necessarily somebody else will come in. So I think, yes, he is entitled. You can dodge the draft because this is a Malchemes Mitzvah. I am adamantly opposed to what some Rabbonim said. It's not a Malchemes Mitzvah because we don't have a Navi, we don't have Sanhedrin. That is nonsense. You need a Navi and Sanhedrin for a Malchemes Hareshus. Malchemes Mitzvah, the Rambam says, any time you fight enemies that come to destroy Israel, it's a Malchemes Mitzvah. The Bachen Reish Mem Tes in Hilchos Shabbos says, even in Golas, when Jews are in danger and you fight to protect them, it's Malchemes Mitzvah. So you cannot dodge the draft. But if you're going to serve in a different unit, then I think it's legitimate. But most of the ones I know, like the two wonderful people sitting on my right and my left, probably wouldn't want that.
Okay, last question. A little embarrassing to move from Pekach Nefesh to something like this, but there's a scarcity of seats on a plane. Can you use protexia to get onto a plane knowing full well that
somebody else will be bumped off?
Bump somebody else off. And plus, there's a request from the island of Rav to continue these type of shilas next week. So I assume there's many more sources that we can.
Okay, Bezrat Hashem. Yeah. So I think you can. I think you cannot. You don't have the right to try to get on a plane where you know that somebody else will be bumped off that flight.
Well, I mean, what's the application of the Shach and the Yerushalmi here? Was this person given the seat already? Was he not given the seat?
That exactly it is it, because if in all probability a person was given a seat and it'll be taken off, then it would be a prohibition. But if not, of course you could.
In other words, you can't bump somebody who has a boarding pass, but if everybody's fighting for the same open seat, then you're allowed to use.
Entitled. Yes.
Then you're